and welcome to the Philly Factor. There's a fund that's been established as a non-medical resource center providing advocacy, education, information, and financial assistance for needs not covered by insurance to families caring for terminally, critically, and chronically ill, severely disabled, or seriously injured children. The Kelly Ann Dolan Memorial Fund was created by Joe and Peggy Dolan after they experienced firsthand the world of trauma, emergency room visits, mounting medical expenses, physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion, and great sadness with the loss of their daughter in 1972. The day after his daughter's death, Joe Dolan started the Wheels in Motion to help families who had to deal with similar circumstances that his family had to endure with the sickness of a family member. On October 6th, the Kelly Ann Dolan Memorial Fund celebrated its 33rd anniversary with the realization that the gift of one loving and very short life has impacted the lives of more than 17,000 families in crisis through the kindness and generosity of many. Here to discuss the work of the Kelly Ann Dolan Memorial Fund is Peggy Dolan, Executive Director of the Fund, and more importantly, the mother of Kelly Ann Dolan. Peggy, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Paul.
Your story is truly inspirational. I went onto the website to find out more information in preparing for the show, and we talked even before the program. Here's your daughter at a very young age diagnosed with a very rare blood disorder.
Right.
And your husband, and we're talking 30 some years ago, but your husband and yourself were so concerned that other families wouldn't have to go through what you went through, that a fund would be established ultimately to help other families that would find themselves in a crisis like your family had experienced.
Right.
Your story leaps ahead some 33 years later, where you are now a 501k
C3
right. Nonprofit organization helping other families. But there's so much to fill in that 33 years, needless to say,
I
right?
think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
First of all, tell us a little bit about your daughter, and you bring home this bundle of joy, but find out shortly thereafter that she is suffering from a blood disorder that would require a blood donor, a marrow transplant, but we're talking about bone marrow transplant?
Yeah, there's a lot more before that. Kelly Ann, when she was about a year and a half, I always worked with my husband. We had a printing and packaging company in Bristol. And my mom used to babysit her. And my mother, I guess when Kelly was about a year and a half old, started to voice concern that she looked pale. And I said, "Oh, Mom, I don't think she's pale. I take her to the doctor, and you know, she has blonde hair." My daughter, Chris, who was 13 months younger, had dark hair and was rosy complected. And I said, "She's not pale, she's fair." But then she started to get bruises on her body. And again, I started to think, well, she's a toddler, she's falling over things, and you know, kids do that.
Sure.
But then she started getting bruises in odd places like her stomach. She had one day, I remember going to pick her up from my mom's, and my mom said, "I don't know how this happened." She said, "But when I went to change her, she's got this big bruise on her stomach." And, you know, a couple times she might have had one on her back. And I know my mom loved her, and I knew she wasn't, she wasn't abusing my daughter. But one morning when she was 2 years old, it was in March, and I went in to get her out of her room, and when I saw her, I knew something was wrong because she wasn't pale. She had a grayish hue. She was so colorless that I called the doctor and I asked if I couldn't have a blood test done. And I took her that morning, and we did the blood test. He said he would have results in about 2 to 3 hours. And you know, as a parent, when something is really wrong, you have this gut feeling. And sure enough, the doctor called me back within about a two-hour period and told me to get her to the hospital right away because she had a hemoglobin of 4.5 when it should be somewhere around 12 to 14. And we were sent to Montgomery Hospital at that time and then transferred to Children's Hospital. And this is back when Children's Hospital was on Bainbridge Street, the little old hospital. And after about a week in the hospital and many kinds of tests, they determined that Kelly had a condition known as aplastic anemia. And aplastic anemia is a malfunctioning of the bone marrow. The bone marrow pretty much stops its production of blood cells, blood products. So you don't make enough red cells to go throughout the body to carry oxygen to all your major organs, or white cells to fight infection, or platelets, which help control bleeding. So essentially, she was a bleeder and had an immune disorder.
Right.
So anytime she was running a fever, we were immediately hospitalized and put in an isolation room. And it was during that whole process of spending weeks in the hospital, because when she was hospitalized, I was hospitalized.
Sure.
You know, you can't leave a 2-year-old in a room by themselves for days on end. So I was so very fortunate that my mother was available to take care of my daughter, Chris, that my husband had a partner to manage things when he couldn't be there. And that was life. But, you know, when you're in a situation like that, you begin to see that being in a children's hospital, and it could be any children's hospital across the United States, that it really is a community within itself. You know, it's the greatest equalizer of race and culture, socioeconomic background, because it really doesn't matter where you live, what kind of car you drive, you know, where you went to school. Everybody's in the same boat, and they became your family. You know, families that go to children's hospitals tend to go back and forth because their children have very serious disorders. So you begin to meet people over and over again, and you get pulled into their family, and we get, you know, them into our family. And that's when we began to hear what terrible things were happening to parents. One single mom in particular that I became friendly with had 2 sons, same ages of my girls, and she had lost her job because of so much time taken away from her job, because she had to be at the hospital or she had to be at home when he was sick. And one day I found her crying in the hall, and I thought she had received really bad news that day. And when I asked her what was wrong, she said, oh, she had had a meeting with the social worker, and she had no money to get home. And the social worker asked her how she was spending her income and, you know, what her expenses were, and then proceeded to have her sign some papers and gave her a $5 bill. Her son had been hospitalized for 8 weeks, and he still had a long hospitalization ahead of him. She had to pay a babysitter once she took the bus back to Camden, and she had to come back to the hospital the next day. And it was just adding insult to injury. And we had heard of so many parents who would lose their jobs, they would lose their benefits. We'd learned of parents whose cars were being repossessed, parents who were losing services, like gas was being turned off, electricity, because they couldn't pay the bills. They were being asked to make choices between paying the rent or paying the co-pays, you know, paying the insurance premiums. And when you have a very seriously ill child, and sometimes these families have 2 and more, especially when genetics is involved, and there are genetic disorders that might affect more than one child in a family, then you begin to see, you know, what terrible hardships exist. Sometimes we would see children in the hospital without visitors, and in the beginning, I thought these kids were orphans, you know, and I thought, gee, there can't be so many orphans in the Philadelphia area. And that's when I discovered how many children had to be in the hospital for days on end without visitors because the parents simply could not afford to be there. They couldn't afford risking the loss of a job or risking the safety of other children. You know, they couldn't afford the babysitting costs. Like I said, I was fortunate that my parents were able to take care of my other daughter, but that's not always the case. And the hardship cases were just awful.
When ultimately the doctors delivered the bad news to you and your husband, that Kellyanne, that there is no help. There is no donor match. The thing that I said at the outset is that go back 30 years, whether it's today, 30 years, or 50 years ago, when a family is dealt this bad news, the family tends to retreat. They tend to pull the covers over their head and not deal with the reality of the situation. Their only concern is about their daughter, their loved one, their immediate family. And yet your husband was intuitive enough to realize, after having seen many of these stories that you just shared with us, that he wanted to do something.
Right.
You know, and so the day after your daughter passes away, he gets the wheels in motion to start the fund. But as you told me before, it actually started 3 months before she passed away, because I guess the doctors had told you at that point there really wasn't much more that they could do.
Yeah, what happened was, even though she carried the diagnosis of aplastic anemia for nearly 5 years, the last 3 months of her life, it actually evolved into a very rare form of leukemia. And we knew that she wasn't going to make it. And that's when my husband started to talk to me about establishing a fund in her memory. And we knew what the needs were for families, but we had not one clue how to go about managing a nonprofit organization and what that would entail. So he actually started setting up the perimeters and the legal work that you have to do to establish a 501c3 before her death, so that when she did die, the first form of income came because of the obituary notice. And this was in 1976, and we raised about $8,000 at that time. We couldn't do anything with it because the 501c3 had not really been developed or confirmed at that point.
So with this $8,000 then that you start out with, let's jump ahead some 33 years now, where you still are working vigorously, I may add, to put money into this fund, operating as a nonprofit, and helping dozens, hundreds, thousands of families deal with some of the circumstances that you had to deal with. And we should also mention here that not only is your daughter, Kellyanne, passes away as a result of this disease, you then have a second child who is then also diagnosed with the same disease. And I hate to even ask the question, how were you prepared to handle that? Everything that you had gone through previously, nothing really prepares you for the doctor to tell you that your next child is suffering from the same disease of your first child.
Well, Kimmy was born almost a year to the day that Kelly died. Kelly died October 5th, 76. Kimmy was born October 8th, 77, and she was fine at birth. She was perfect, you know, we tested her, she was absolutely great. But one morning when she was 4 months old, I went in to get her out of her crib, and when I unsnapped her sleeper, found that her entire body was covered in petechiae. And petechiae to you or anyone else would look like a rash, little purple spots all over the skin. But I knew that petechiae was a sign of a critically low platelet count. And I called the hospital right away, and we were admitted that day. And they kept saying, don't worry, it can't be the same thing. But you know, when it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, in time it turned out to be the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't diagnose Kimmy. She looked like she had aplastic anemia, but because of her sister's condition and the way that it evolved into leukemia, they were afraid to call it leukemia.
Right.
Or they had nothing to base it on, actually. So, but within 4 years, Kimmy, just like Kellyanne, lived on blood transfusions. The two of them would get transfused anywhere between 5 to 15 times a month. And each transfusion was anywhere between 4 to 6 units of blood products. So it takes 4 to 6 people to make a transfusion possible. When Kimmy was 4, in March of 1982, she became resistant to blood transfusions. And that's when we had to work closely with the Red Cross to identify about 10 people within the Penn Jersey region to make it possible for us to make arrangements for a bone marrow transplant. And we were sent to Seattle, Washington, and in May of 1982, my late husband was her donor. He was an incredible match, like he was with Kellyanne. But with Kellyanne, he had been her blood donor. He would donate platelets to her all the time. Because he had been a donor, he was unable to actually be a marrow donor because she would have rejected it. When Kimmy took sick, they refused to take any blood products from family members in case we needed a bone marrow. And so sure enough, she was able to take his marrow, and Kimmy is now 32 years old and married and doing great.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah.
The fund today really helps, as I said before, thousands of families. And you're constantly raising money because you can only do as much as you can do with the money that is coming in. So in this current economic climate then, how do you continue the legacy of your late husband? How do you continue the fund in honor of your daughter, Kelly, given the economic climate where people might want to donate, but they're reluctant these days because everybody's trying to make ends meet? So it's not just your organization, but across the board, nonprofits are dealing with the same issues as your organization.
Well, I always say we're very lucky because our organization is easy to buy into. It's a mission that can affect a lot of people. We're not disease specific. We don't just raise money for families who have children with cancer or who have children with cystic fibrosis. We raise money for families who are affected by all kinds of illnesses, disabilities, and injuries. So it touches home for a lot of people. We never receive government funds. We raise our money all sorts of ways through private foundations, corporate foundations. A lot of community organizations like Rotaries raise money for us. Women's clubs raise money for us. But I think our most inspirational group are schools. We have little preschoolers doing funny feet walk for kids and raising thousands of dollars. We have grammar schools doing volleyball marathons. This Saturday we're getting ready for the Tamanin Middle School basketball shootout. This is the 10th year that this school in Warrington will do this all-day event. The teachers get involved, the parents get involved. They've set a goal this year for $35,000. They have raised over $155,000 in the last 10. These are middle school students.
Yeah, amazing.
It really is. I mean, colleges, LaSalle, for instance, I mean, they've done just a competition in the public speaking course, and we've won a persuasive talk by one of the students, and then they take up a collection and raise money. It's just amazing the ways that the kids get involved, and they thoroughly put themselves into it.
I want to mention the website because we could sit here and talk about the organization, but if we don't direct people to the website and find out more about the Kellyanne Dolan Memorial Fund, you can go to KADMF, which is the Kellyanne Dolan Memorial Fund.org. KADMF.org. You can find out more information there. And you're always looking for volunteers. Because
Absolutely.
When you talk about grassroots organizations, your organization, I guess, typifies or personifies how a volunteer, whether they have an hour, whether they have 10 hours a week, whether they have 40 hours a week to volunteer, it really does make a difference in promoting what it is that you're trying to get out there and helping families who find themselves in similar circumstances as your family, as well as dozens, thousands of other families across the country.
Yeah. We have all sorts of opportunities, whether it's to serve on the committee or the board, or do fundraisings, fundraisers for us, or introduce our organization to a school or an organization, or if you've got certain talents like graphic arts and photography. We just held one of our largest events about a week and a half ago, and Wine and Winter. We had 500 and some people show up, and we had 35 restaurateurs, and we had students come who are photography students that took photos all night long. So We've got a great array of, visuals
Sure.
that we can put on the website and use for press releases and gather new participants for next year.
Do you find that some of the families that have been helped by the fund get involved in some way, shape, or form as a way to give back to your organization?
Well, when you just said that, it brought something to mind. Somebody said to me one time about our organization, what a great way to remember your daughter. And it just struck me so funny because I don't need this fund to remember my daughter.
Right.
I mean, the fund for me is a way for us to give back because you don't go through a catastrophic illness alone, I've discovered. And just think of blood donors. I mean, my girls used over 800 units of blood products. Blood donors are people I never got to meet, never got to see, never got to thank. So you just kind of keep that going. But I think some of the greatest thank you letters that we get usually end with, someday when life gets better for us, I want to do for somebody what you've done for us. I mean, you can't ask for more than that. It's like that whole pay it forward, pay it back mentality. So I'm asked to talk to schools a lot. I address assemblies. And generally when it's the younger students, I'll ask if they've seen the movie, Pay It Forward. And usually there's a high percentage that have. And I said, well, I'll tell you a story about paying it back. So I said, I've been paying it back for so long that I don't know if I'm paying it back or paying it forward. And it reminds me of a quote by Reverend Robert Schuller, who said that giving never moves in a straight line. It always moves in circles. And that's how this fund is. It's like constantly changing and evolving and pulling more people into the circle, and it's amazing. It's an absolute gift.
One other thing I want to touch upon before we run out of time here is that there may be a family watching the program right now who might be in need of assistance. They could reach out to the organization through the website or call the office.
Well,
go ahead.
They can, but our referrals, we work with the social work departments, case managers, visiting nurses. They make the referrals to our organization. If a family were to call us, we wouldn't know if it was a credible call or not. So this way, everything we get is credible and it's been screened, and then we just process whatever the request is. And so it's clean cut,
Which I was thinking 30 some years ago when you got started in this, one probably never even thinks about that's what you need to do in order to ascertain that the request is credible or not. You're just so interested in starting the fund, but there are so many other things that need to take place in order before you can get a nonprofit organization off the ground.
And I think one of my biggest worries early on was that I would do something wrong, that however I was managing it wasn't right, because this carries my daughter's name. And I wouldn't want anything to tarnish it or make it not good.
In the case of your family, you were dealt a bump in the road. You were dealt a devastating loss. And then there's that old saying, when life throws lemons at you, you make lemonade. And as I said at the outset of the interview, your story is very inspirational. There may be other people out there that hear you talk and listen to you talk, and they say, gee, there is hope out there. There is something that I can do, perhaps, to give back or pay it forward, or instead of retreating from society, that there might be a way to honor a loved one who may have passed away for whatever circumstances. So your story is encouraging to other people who may find themselves in the same set of circumstances. They want to do something, but they just don't know how to start. So in the minute or two that we have left, advice that you can give to these people.
Okay. I get calls all the time from friends of friends who want to set up an organization, and I say, do you really want to set up a full-blown organization, because it can take over your life? I often joke, I said, if my husband were alive, we'd probably be divorced by now, because this is my life. But if you've had an experience with a child with some certain disease or disorder, and you want to raise money to help with that disease or disorder, connect yourself with an organization that might be doing that kind of thing, and do something in your child's name for that organization. You know, the paybacks are great.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fast moving half hour, and I thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Appreciate it.
And telling us about your great organization. And if people want more information, they can go to the website. Is there also a phone number we could give out?
Yeah, but I might say we have a new website. You can still get there by kadmf.org, but it's simpler now. It's just dolanfund.org, or call us at our office at 215-643-0763.
Again, if you would like more information, the website and the phone number are out there. And who knows, you might even want to pay it forward or pay back, whatever you want to call it. But the most important thing is to get involved. And if you find yourself looking for a cause, if you want to volunteer for an organization, you might want to consider the Kellyanne Dolan Memorial Fund. My thanks to Peggy Dolan, Executive Director of the Kellyanne Dolan Memorial Fund, for being with us on this edition of the program. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
My name is Paul Perello. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time on the Philly Factor. And we just sit there and chit-chat.